Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Welcome back. Let's go around and say our names. I'm Jim.
Douglas.
I'm Henry.
Yates.
Aaron.
Roger.
Mike.
George.
Jerry.
Patrick.
Baruch.
Richard Azzolini.
Brian.
Joe Castrovizzi. Lee Robbins.
My name is Paige.
Dennis.
Doug.
Peter.
Christopher. Yeah.
My name is David.
My name's Daniel.
Mark.
Jack.
Mark. George. Paul Jeffrey.
I'm Shantan.
Cass. And Jerry Martin.
John.
Nicholas.
Ralph.
Andreas.
Ray. I'm Ray Dyer.
I'm Richard. And I'm Michael.
Well, our speaker is Steve Tierney, and we're delighted to have you. Our facilitator is here, and I don't have a newsletter, so I can't introduce you.
No idea who you are.
So you have to tell us what's important. But welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Grateful and impressed that so many people are here on Sunday morning at 10:30, especially in a week where there might be some other activities going on that you need to tend to. But it's great to be here. I've been to this group sitting out there a few times and over a lot of years, and it's nice to be back and nice to be up here, but we'll see how that works out towards the end. So what I wanted to do today was just talk a little bit about what brought me here and the way that I practice Buddhism and the way that works out in real time or in real life for me. My approach to practice is very sort of practical. The way I got here, the way my practice has continued. And that's only made interesting by the fact that in the next few months I'll be ordained at the San Francisco Zen Center as a priest. And we'll talk about that some, but those of you that know that place might think it odd that somebody's approach, which is very practical in the streets, would be involved there and being considered for ordination by those good folks. But more about that as we progress. But this group, I think, is a critical one, even though I don't get a chance to get here often. In groups like this, I travel a lot in my job and see and experience lots of Buddhist communities and lots of gay communities. And I think we have an expression in Buddhism called Kalyanamitta, which is a community, or which means spiritual friend. And Kalyanamitta Sangha would be a community of spiritual friends, and I think that's what this is. And in a nutshell, we know, I think, as gay men, that we do better as a group than we do individually in many ways. And we know that because for some of us who are old enough, we know that in the 60s and 70s we came together, and some before that, but for me personally in the late 60s and early 70s, we all came together as a community when it was illegal to be us. I was living in Michigan and then in Massachusetts, and it was before the laws that said we could freely associate. I don't know if any of the rest of you were out early enough. The bars I went to when I first came out as a gay man, you went in and there was a blue neon light around the outside. Well, first of all, you knocked on the door, and they opened up a little window. And I never forget, I was 18 years old, and I went in. It was the Woodward in Detroit, if any of you remember, and you went in off a back alley. And you knocked, and they opened the window, and of course, I thought I was passing in all of society and getting along really well. And so, as a friend of mine had told me how to get to this bar, and that they wouldn't open this window, and I thought there was going to be a magic question. That they might turn me away because I look so straight. And the guy opened the window and said, "Oh, come on in, honey." That was my coming out story. And the other thing that happened shortly after that is I was a student at Wayne State University, and where SDS was founded, and I was invited to, in early 1970, to a meeting, and they were planning an anti-war demonstration, and they said, "You should come to this one." It was a friend named Dewey Ames. And I said, "Okay, I'm certainly interested in pacifism, and we were all opposed to the war." And I said, "But what's special about this meeting?" He said, "You'll see." And so got into this room, and it looked not unlike this room. And as we went around talking about this demonstration, they said, well, we want to make a special point that we are peaceful. We want to make sure that our signs are particularly artistic. I was not getting it. And we want to make sure, and they did a number of things we wanted to make sure of, and ultimately I said, "Well, why is it we want to make sure of all those things?" And he looked at me, rolled his eyes, and said, "Because we're gay men." And I, as you might imagine, said, "What? Why have you invited me here?" And I looked around the room, and as I say, it looked pretty much like this. And I thought, my entire literal, many of you have had enormously difficult coming out stories, and I do offer my empathy, but that was mine, because I thought, "No, I'm not gay, I don't know why you invited me here." And I looked around at all of you and thought, "Okay, I'm joining." And the next few months, I don't remember, but I'm told that I was a party favor for people in that organization at age 18, and happy to do so. But I think that continued for all of us who were around in the 70s and 80s. It was in some states, including Massachusetts, we passed the second gay rights bill in the country. So it wasn't illegal anymore to be us, but discrimination and stigma were everywhere, and so we stuck together and formed a culture and formed a community everywhere except in our spiritual practice for most of us in those early days. And then it's obvious the 80s and 90s came along, and we were literally dying, and we had no choice but to stick together. And as gay men, and our lesbian sisters joined us in taking care of each other in ways that the government didn't just neglect us, they refused. And so we banded together in many ways, and spiritual practice started to take shape in some places. And so we began to have communities that were based on the things that culture is supposed to be based on: common goals, survival, taking care of each other. And so what we figured out, many of us, is that we had been driven from or escaped from the religions of our childhood in many cases. And some brave and hardy souls stayed there in those religions and spiritual practices and fought then and continue to fight the good fight for recognition and equality. But for many of us, we were driven away, and when we left religion, we left spiritual life entirely for a while. And that left for a lot of us a searching and the big questions in life weren't getting answered. But it was the 80s, and we were busy drinking and having sex, so the big questions sort of sat back here for a little while, and we figured we'd get to them later, and indeed we did. So I think for a lot of us, finding our way here, and for me, we have in Buddhism, which you all know, is called the Way Seeking Mind Talk. So a little bit about how I got here specifically was that I was working in Boston and was lucky enough to have as an early activist, I moved to Boston from Detroit because I had gone, if any of you know Boston at all, or knew it back in the day, I had gone and there was a bar called Chaps, right next door to a bar called Sticks, Chap Sticks, very clever. And having come from Detroit, I went to this bar, they were having something called Tea Dance, and so at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we walked down what I thought was a major street and turned into a gay bar that had glass on the windows, so nobody was ashamed and nobody was embarrassed. And then later that day, we went on Charles Street to a coffee shop, which was also a gay coffee shop, the Charles Street Meeting House, also with windows and people coming and going and talking to each other and holding hands. And so I knew for sure that I needed to leave Detroit and come to this place. And shortly after being there, I managed to get very involved in the movement, and my particular interest, even long before HIV, was in our health. And so I was involved in things having to do with the health of youth and young adults particularly, because way back in the beginning I was one. And mental health aspects and addiction became an interest really early on. And what seemed clear to me was that in many cases that sense of community was what was missing for a lot of folks, myself included, was some central organizing principle. What were we doing here? And so I was working with a group we put together called the Boston Street Youth Outreach Program. And so we had kids who were involved in commercial sex and drugs that we provided a shelter for them, and then ultimately a clinic. And at this shelter we started doing just some quiet time, we called it, because their lives were so chaotic. And they were trying to figure out, adults, had not been good to them. Most of the adults they were engaged with wanted something, and it was that sort of thing. And they were busy trying to, Boston during the winter, it's 20 degrees below zero. So, there's sometimes a romantic notion of street youth and what that means. But these young folks were living on the street when the only reason to do that was it was safer than where they came from. So when we brought them in the beginning there were lots of fights and territorial stuff going on and all that. And so we developed this practice of having quiet time. Somewhere I managed, I think, to find a brochure that said something about mindfulness. So we actually called it mindful sitting. And our sponsors from one of the local medical schools said, you can't do that. If those kids are in any danger of psychosis, quiet sitting time will make them psychotic. Just so you know. Some of you are probably in danger now. So the good doctors said that you can't do that. We did it anyway, and the long story short, I'm happy to report 20 years later it's still going on 4 nights a week, and the young people are still participating, and they still find it, as we did here this morning, an opportunity to just get quiet and get centered. And so that led me on a personal journey. I thought, wow, that's there's something to this, and let me take a look and find out what it is. And so I went off to a retreat center in upstate New York called Dai Bosatsu Zendo. And I went there because I had read a brochure that said, this was a number of years later, a brochure that said that Deputy Abbott or something, the Vice Abbott, was a gay guy from New York. And that the letter in this particular newsletter was from the abbot talking about how it made perfect sense for gay folks looking for spirituality to come to Buddhism because it was an open practice, and you took the parts that you really liked, and there was lots of room for everybody, is basically what it said. And so those of us who have practiced in various lineages know that that was advertising. But it got me there, so I guess it was effective advertising if that was their goal. When I got there, I sat a 4-day retreat the first time. Now, they had invited me to this retreat. And by invite, I mean they gave me this brochure and then took a check. So I got up there, and I had, as a young Catholic kid in high school, I had gone on retreats, right? Some of you may have had those experiences in religion or school or something. Retreat was you went away on Friday night and played guitar and smoked some dope and said a few prayers at some point. And at the end of the weekend, you all hugged each other and said, oh, our lives are changed. We will never lose touch with each other. We will be best friends forever. And then you got in the car and went home and never saw any of those people again. Which, given the attachment disorder I had, was perfect for me. 2 or 3 times a year, I had friends for 3 days. I thought that was a pretty good deal. So, at this retreat, the good news was that this retreat at Dai Bosatsu Zendo, we sat still for 4 days, and And as you can see, if you're an activist by nature, I said, we're going to do what? She said, you're going to face that wall, and you'll talk again on Monday. And I said, right, I'll be talking about you on Monday as well. The good news was when you walked in the door, everyone wore a gray cassock prayer dress. The first time when I walked in, she said, you're going to be sitting over there, you'll be by the window, and here, put this on. Cocktail party, we're wearing dresses. So there was just enough to get me to sit, and plus it was on top of a mountain in upstate in western New York, and I had no idea how to drive down from there at night, so I thought, well, I'll give it one day before I leave. But at some point during those 4 days, the good news is I actually achieved some moments of clarity. I got calm. I was able to sit still and focus on my breathing. Everything inside me that had been chaotic and running at full speed for however many years I was alive at that point, probably 30-some by then, everything about that, about my life, just suddenly came present in the moment. Luckily, they sort of figured out that in order to keep me seated, they needed to do something, and so they put me in a window, and the retreat center overlooks Beaver Lake. And so maybe from here to the street, and there were all these, let's call Beaver Lake because there were beavers, and they were, my first night I was thinking, rodents. This is not a good place to put me from a city boy. But by the end of the fourth day, that's part of it was that way I was able to focus and get calm was just to, as I was trying to sit, to watch something I'd never seen before with a safe glass wall in front of me so they couldn't get at me. So I managed to have those few moments of calm, and those few moments of calm led me to some moments of awareness and clarity around how I was leading my life and how fast I was going and how much I was drinking and drugging and lots of other questions that came up. And so I went back to Boston, down from the hill, and sort of started a practice, became a buffet Buddhist, as some of you probably know. I went anywhere where there was a sitting, and all different lineages, all different. Some of it was real, some of it was personality-driven. It didn't matter. So I read every book that I could get my hands on, and I continued to drink and do drugs for 10 more years, so about 7 more years. So I had a developing spiritual practice of meditation and a cocaine addiction. Go figure. So my meditation was really quick in the beginning days. But I did manage to get some good teaching from a number of people, one of whom was a woman named Sylvia Bornstein, who's at Spirit Rock up in Marin. They teach also in Western Mass, and so I had a chance to study with her a bit. And the practice that she teaches, if any of you know her, is called metta, or loving kindness. And it just made so much sense to me that if you wanted to get centered, if you wanted to have your life make sense, that you started with you, but then quickly paid attention to others. And that the degree to which one could get outside oneself after getting centered really began to make sense to me as a spiritual practice. And so for me, that began a process. And so not having any sense whatsoever, I decided to move from Boston to San Francisco because I looked at the map and I thought, well, I can walk over to Spirit Rock and sit with Sylvia from time to time. Because in Boston, many of us didn't have cars because it's a very small, tight city, and the gay community was sort of right in the middle, and you frankly never left the gay community unless you were going to New York or coming out here for vacation. So I didn't have a car, but I thought I'd come out here and study with Sylvia at Spirit Rock. And so, for me, it was like looking back after all these years. I've been practicing now for a little over 20 years, and looking back, it all sort of looks like there was, if you have to tell the story, it looks logical. It was all either karma or just dumb luck, going from place to place. So when I got here and discovered that Spirit Rock was too far away to go very often, although I have gone frequently, the San Francisco Zen Center was a few blocks from my house, and so I stumbled in there one night, during the means of which time I had also gotten clean and sober. But I stumbled into the Zen Center and found a different practice, which was the practice, Soto Zen, and the primary thing they said to me those first days was just sitting. You didn't have to study, didn't have to do lots of stuff. In the beginning, that's what they told me. The deal was just sit. The most important thing was to develop a consistent, regular sitting practice, so that, in fact, those occasional moments of clarity or sobriety became your practice. And so I've been there now studying for 16 years at the San Francisco Zen Center. And the practice, all lineages have something to offer, and whichever methods you use for meditation and or formal Buddhist practice, all good and all collaborative and in partnership. But for me, that one particularly worked. And what worked for me, I think, was the whole notion that if I got quiet, and if I could actually achieve that sort of sacred stillness, my brain, my mind and my heart got lined up. And as you know in our teachings, we talk about wisdom comes from the heart, and compassion actually comes from the mind. Because if our heart is in good shape and we're gifted with compassion, then the only logical thing to do is be good to other folks. And so that made sense to me. And so I've been practicing there for quite a while, and in the last couple of years have done a number of things with that practice, including there's a Monday night and Friday night group for meditation for people in recovery, and I'm one of the regular teachers for those two groups. I'm a regular teacher at the Monday night Gay and Lesbian Sangha at the Community Center, and I speak and do retreats for gay men and others and folks in recovery around anywhere where anybody thinks it would be useful. So I'm happy to do that. And most recently in my own professional work, I teach at a place called California Institute for Clinical Studies, which is, I teach in the counseling psychology program, and we prepare our students to be attuned to mind, body, and spirit in the professional work they do. So I get a chance now to bring the spiritual practice to my job. And then as I prepare for retirement, a friend and I, a partner and I have formed the San Francisco Mindfulness Foundation, which specifically works with folks dealing with mental health and addiction and brings mindfulness-based therapies, the work of John Kabat-Zinn, in terms of mindfulness-based stress reduction, and there's also mindfulness-based relapse prevention that was put together by a guy named Alan Marlott at the University of Washington. He sadly died this past April, but the work continues. And so we have a group here that's doing that work now. So finally, at age 60, I've had the opportunity for work and spiritual life and gay life to all come together in some ways that are really profound. And what's interesting about that story is only that each of you could and can and will hopefully tell your stories, and they're the same. We found ourselves in a place where life could get better. As the campaign for our young folks says, life can get better and does. And we embraced some sort of practice on the cushion and in real life that we embraced it because life could get better. I think there's some folks who would tell you that the first tenet, the first noble truth is that there is suffering. And indeed there is, and that we should respect suffering, and indeed we do. But I think I've experienced some folks who get really caught in those first two noble truths. There is suffering, and there's a reason for suffering, and that's getting attached, and etc. But I think for many of us, there's also a way out of suffering, the third noble truth, and a way to do that. And so we do that in a number of ways through our practices here, and so I want to talk about a few of those. But I was thinking of all of you this morning, and I was looking at Time Magazine. If everybody's seen it, the Person of the Year. They always choose their Person of the Year. The Person of the Year is the protesters, so the millions of folks all across the world. And Time Magazine described them as folks who took a moment and decided that we had had enough, and that we wanted to do something different in whichever country it was in. enough of injustice, enough of inequality, enough of stigma and discrimination. We'd had enough, and people wanted things to be different. And I think in our own way, and I don't know what activities anybody here is involved in, but in our own way, the fact that you're here on Sunday morning sitting on a cushion, when we could be any number of places, including at some scandalous brunch talking about people. Some of that may still happen today. But the fact that we're here, the fact that we're committed to our own spiritual life and each other, says to me that in terms of heroes or people in our community, each of you and each of us qualifies for that. Because I think we're doing something that's really profound. A teacher at the San Francisco Zen Center named Darlene Cohen, that I hope some of you had a chance to know, also passed away this year. It's not going to be my theme, everybody's not dead, I promise. But Darlene Cohen was a person who lived with really serious arthritis for a long time and then ultimately also had cancer. And she said in her teaching that the most important thing was to reduce her suffering and then to model that behavior for others. And I think that's a really wonderful and positive way to approach life. That in fact there is suffering. You know, we suffer because we're not in charge of everything, and then sometimes we suffer because we are in charge of everything. We suffer because the world is not completely fair. We suffer because we have really great experiences and they come to an end. We have relationships and they come to an end. We suffer because we in fact get older and experience the things that happen in life throughout that life process. But I think that's a really great way to approach life, and it's a really truly Buddhist way, that there is a way to reduce suffering, that's perfectly okay, and that there are actually some tools that we have as Buddhists that help us do that, and that if we have experiences of joy ourselves and with each other, that it behooves us to model that for other folks. Because there are some folks, every time we're having an up day, there's probably somebody around us who's having a day on the other side of that cycle. And so the yin and yang, as it were, of life, and we can in fact model how we got to that good day, and how we're embracing it without attaching to it, so that we're not inclined to have a bad day right after that. But I think Buddhism really gives us a number of ways as a community to celebrate who we are and what we're doing. One of which is the concept of interconnectedness, the no separate self. When I started out, I said we came together as a community, you come together as the fellowship. And we do that because we know life is better. And somehow life is easier to manage and more joyful if we do things in a group. If we are fellow travelers along a road to awakening and liberation. And so it makes sense to me that Buddhist principle of interconnectedness, that there is no separate self. I am who I am right now because I'm sitting here and you're sitting there. And in a couple of hours, when we're all at wicked brunches somewhere, or whatever our next activity of the day is, we will continue to be ourselves, but we'll be in a different position, in a different moment, having a different direct experience. And so that's, I think, a really important piece of the Buddhist teaching that fits us as a community. That we know that if we're going to be healthy, if we're going to have security as we get older, if we're going to have relationships that are honored and respected, all of that requires that we all be in this together. So it just makes sense that along the spiritual path, that our meditation and that our study and that our embrace of spiritual principles would also make sense if we did it together. So, the founder of San Francisco Zen Center was Suzuki Roshi. And Suzuki Roshi used to do a lot of teaching in which he would say the most important thing. And then he would tell you the story. And then he would later say, okay, and now the most important thing. So towards the end of his teaching, and it's still pretty common over those retreats called "What is the most important thing?" And you go and spend 3 days studying all the various teachings, and at the end, kind of like those retreats I used to go on, at the end everyone holds hands and says the most important thing is everything. So in case you're inclined to spend 3 days and some money, the answer is everything. You can just send me the checks. But I think one of the things that Suzuki Roshi taught that I really, really appreciate is there's this notion that there's some special way to have a spiritual life. Some of you have probably been to Zen centers or churches or spiritual practices across the country where you see people and they're across the street at a tea shop and they're all smiling and laughing and having fun, and then they come in the door of the Zendo and they develop pious face. There's this look they get, and it's like it is the most bizarre thing in the world. And then if you let one of them sit up here, then they really they like dress all in black and they get a look, and it's like, what is wrong with that? And they say things like, "I've been practicing for 35 years and my life is filled with joy now." and you're all sitting out there thinking, I'd like to have some of that. But Suzuki Roshi was really, really, really clear about that. He used to, at Zen Center, and he was passed away before I got there, but he used to go outside and with folks who were smoking and carrying on, and just to get to know the real them. And he said to folks, there is an old koan that says, "When you are you, Zen is Zen." When you are you, Zen is Zen. And so Zen is meditation. So when you are you, meditation is meditation, and that is the most important thing. And that is the most important thing. And so what he said to the students, really just be yourself. That was his teaching. His teaching was just be yourself. There's a famous teaching in Buddhism. There's 2,500 years or 3,000 years worth of teachings and Dharma, and you can get master's degrees and doctoral degrees and blue robes and brown robes and all kinds of different colored robes for studying the Dharma. The fact of the matter is the Buddha taught that the Dharma is like a raft, and you get to the bank of that important river and you build the strongest raft you can possibly build, and then you get across the river. And then the most important thing, he said, it's not to pick that raft up and carry it up the mountain or down the street. The most important thing is to let go of that raft. You've now done it. Send the raft back so someone else can use it. And it's just, to me, such an important thing. If you remember the stories in our teaching, when the first person was received enlightenment from the Buddha, nowadays there are 15-year-long courses and rituals that one must go through and all sorts of other things. The first person that received enlightenment from the Buddha, awakening from the Buddha, people know the story, right? The Buddha was holding a flower, and everyone was waiting for him to give an enormously deep and thoughtful speech about the flower, and one guy sitting right over there smiled, like, that flower is really beautiful. The Buddha said, you got it. It's about right here, in this moment. You were fully present for this experience, so you have Dharma transmission. The other thing Suzuki Roshi said, which I love and I hope you do, is the teaching. He said that enlightenment is an accident, and that Zazen makes us accident prone. So, right? So for me, that's a really good way to think about it, right? We will have that moment of awakening about who we are in the moment. What's our direct experience living in San Francisco or the Bay Area in December of 2011? What's the actual experience, and what can we do with that? As engaged Buddhists or as engaged members of the community, what can we do with what we got right now? And so when we sit, our mind and our heart can align. That's why we sit in that posture, right? So compassion and wisdom, that's already here, because as you know, what the Buddha said was that you don't need anything. You don't need to go to school. You don't need to join an organization. You don't need to pay dues, although I'm sure we'll ask for a donation. So you don't need to, but it's a good idea. You don't need to do any of that. The Buddha was very clear. We each have Buddha nature. We have, right now, everybody in this room has the capacity to be fully awakened. And what gets in the way of that is the way we live. It's busy out in the street, it's busy in our homes, it's busy at our jobs, it's busy wherever we're going the rest of the day today, and it's really busy in here, right? So we're busy evaluating ourselves and each other and comparing and contrasting, and it's the end of the year, so some of you may get engaged in what has become of me, how did I get to this place, and where am I going, and that becomes a huge ritual that involves whiteboards and flip charts. And so the fact of the matter is that when we sit, it makes us, it prepares us by getting us calm, getting us centered, helping us realize that can't pay any bills right here, can't get any more college degrees right here for the next hour, can't solve the problem with my landlord during this hour. And so you get to have a mantra that says, not now, right? Breathing in and breathing out, you can just say, not now. Things arise and things can go away, not now. Because it's such a wonderful teaching moment, which is that for 1 hour or an hour and a half while we're in this building, nothing. We're with 50 other guys that have our back and our spiritual interests. And so we are as safe as we can ever be. And way back in 1970, we used to carry posters that said an army of lovers can never be defeated. And so, if you look around here, we have the capacity to achieve liberation, as the Buddha promised us, and achieve that in just because, it's the most important thing. And so, I want to give some time for questions and answers. So I think what I would say is that there are some really easy ways that we can remember during the next few weeks what a gift you have here and what a gift you have internally. And I think those, mindfulness practice is one of many practices that we have, but it really goes right to the heart of getting through the next month, right? Because mindfulness practice, there's 4 foundations of mindfulness. It tells us first to get really still and be aware of the body, mindfulness of the body. And we all have somatic reactions to what's going on, right? If I say to you, you're going home to have dinner and a long weekend with your family next weekend, some of you will have a reaction to that. For some, it's a joyful thing and it's great. Others of you will begin to twitch, and your neck will stiffen up. Your body is talking to you. And so you get aware of that, right? I had an issue with anger for a long time, both during my drinking and drugging and for years afterwards. And I worked with a therapist, a somatic therapist, who helped me figure out that any time I was about to get angry, my jaw tightened up. Now, in the early days, it would tighten up, and then I would hear a voice saying horrible things to people. And it took me a few minutes to realize that it was one of my many alter egos. It was me. But I learned to practice, mindfulness of the body. I learned to practice, and that's what we teach in mindfulness-based stress reduction and relapse prevention. Know when something's happening. Your body will speak to you. And we all know our body speaks to us lots of times, and pay attention to that. And it's a wonderful thing to do. Second phase, the foundation of mindfulness is mindfulness of your feelings. Feelings are yours. You're having them. It's an opportunity. Something is pleasant or unpleasant. For years, I work in human services and mental health, and people walked around saying, "We run a program that's completely non-judgmental." And I would, get paid a lot of money to consult, and my consultation consisted of bullshit. Most certainly do not. You might run a program in which you acknowledge that we are discerning creatures and that you have managed that you are aware of that. But we walked in the door to this room and we're all evolved spiritual people. And we know that some of us are dressed better than others, and we know that some of us are looking tired because, we checked around. And so we are discerning people, and that's life. That's why we don't live in Fresno, and if anyone's here from Fresno, Fresno's really lovely. But we made a choice to be here today and not there. So mindfulness of the feelings, and we have a wonderful opportunity. These are weeks coming ahead, whether you have holidays or not. Some of us don't have holidays in our traditions or the traditions we're creating for ourselves. But Walmart and Macy's have not figured out that you don't have a holiday yet. So you're going to have to see a lot of it and experience it. So you're having feelings, and it's important to take care of those. And, Kalyanamita, you have friends around who you can talk to about it. And so, if you're having feelings, honor those. Mindfulness of the mind is the third foundation, and that's where those feelings begin to tell us stories, right? Science now with the fMRI test tell us that when we have a strong emotion, whether it's fear or anger or whatever it is, the strong emotion lasts how long? 90 seconds. About 90 seconds. No matter how much you're scared, the original feeling is 90 seconds. And then the brainwave starts to change, and then what happens is we begin to tell a story. Somebody jumped out and spooked me, and oh my God. And so now it's like, well, I'm embarrassed that I screamed like a girl. Or you could have caused a heart attack for someone my age. Or who told you to buy that sweater? Don't be jumping out in front of me anymore. So something happens that I begin to tell a story, and oftentimes way more serious than that. That fright reminds me of when I was a child and things were frightening, or the way you spoke to me reminds me of the way someone spoke to me a long time ago that was painful and is still painful. So there's stories. And so what we want to do is be aware of what's going on in our mind, and meditation and having spiritual friends helps us to deal with that. And then the final one is mindfulness of the Dharma, mindfulness of the mind of the mind, as we call it. And that includes things like the factors of enlightenment, that includes the Four Noble Truths, that includes where we engage those things that we have the capacity to learn and embrace that can help us to have a mindfulness practice. So, there is suffering and there's an end to suffering. So, and we're Buddhists, so we don't think that that's either or. There is suffering and there's an end to suffering, always both. And I think my spiritual practice is that I get to make a choice about that. I get to know that there's suffering. Life's not always going to go the way I want it to. And actually sometimes that's a really good thing. And sometimes I'm going to have the opportunity to move forward by using the tools that this program, that this spiritual practice gives us. And the final thing I'll say is that there's the factors of enlightenment, and you've probably studied them. If you haven't, you can look them up. But there are 7 factors of enlightenment, and the final 3 of those factors of enlightenment have to do with calming. The instructions of the Buddha for how to live an engaged life in the community has a lot to do with calming. And I think most of you would probably agree with me that, there are some folks who say Buddhists are all about, it's indifferent, we sit on a cushion, we don't pay any attention, we're not engaged in the world, we don't care about other people, and I think that's not it at all. There are lots of folks doing really wonderful work, engaged Buddhist work. But more importantly, I think, as I said in the beginning, that all of us are doing engaged Buddhist work when we sit down. Because if you go out in the world after this and you're less angry, the world is a better place. And if you guys go out and you're less scared, the world is a closer place. And so our practice is to get calm enough to figure out who we really are. And to get calm enough to figure out that by working together and living together, we change the world around us. We change the way healthcare is delivered in the world by the way we took care of each other during the HIV epidemic, which continues. But we changed the way medicine is done. We changed the way the healthcare industry responds to communities. Lots more to do, but we actually have made lots of changes in the world. And I don't think you have to belong to an organization or wear a button or carry a banner. I think when you leave here today, you will have had an opportunity to sit quietly. You will have had an opportunity to look at 30 other guys who feel exactly as you do, that life can get better. And when we leave here, we'll leave with that sense that, you know what, we have some equanimity. There is suffering, there's an end to suffering, there is chaos, there's calm, and when we walk out the door together, we're going to take that calm into our community and our families. And I hope that you keep it through the first of the year anyway, and then we'll come back and get some more. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. We have time for some questions.
Yeah. Questions or thoughts about how you're going to survive the holidays, or any other tidbits? Yes.
I just wanted to thank you for your benevolence. That is wonderful. Thank you.
First, I really appreciated your talk also, and this, I don't know if this is a relevant question or not, but what struck me, because you had talked about working with younger people and with community, I'm wondering if you have any sense of how the internet is changing community and meaning and so forth, which I think is quite profound, and I suspect all of us are too old to have much of a sense of it.
Yeah, well, I agree with that last part. I teach in a graduate school where people are mostly working with folks younger, so there's this connection, and there's an interesting sort of concept that we, if you think about it, we're immigrants in that world, right? So the young people, the teenagers are growing up. That's the only, that's the language they speak, and they speak in 140 word. That's if you ask for a major thesis to be written, that's 140 characters or words. But we, learned to write longhand and to think in a different way, literally in a different logical sequence. And so part of it is we have this wonderful opportunity, if we can embrace that and not be afraid of it, to know that this is yet another language we can learn and another culture that we can make welcome in our communities. Young and old in the gay community has always been challenging. I volunteer every week at Magnet, the clinic in the Castro. And so yesterday, my clients happened to be 4 folks in their very early 20s. The biggest challenge of which is when you say your birthday. And, we're in a completely non-judgmental clinic. The voice in the back of my head is saying, "You're too young to be having sex, go home." But I do think for all of us, the internet is we're Buddhists, so everything is on a continuum. Everything coexists, right? We don't do dualistic thinking. So I think the internet is an opportunity to be really isolated. And to learn a set, I was talking to some of these young folks yesterday, to learn a set of skills that to me, and probably to some of you, seem absolutely counterintuitive to forming meaningful partnerships or relationships or, not like in the old days when we went out to dark bars and went in the basement and took our pants down and, formed meaningful relationships. That lasted 12 minutes, or really 3, but we say 12 for the record. But it's a different culture, and I do think the reach out that we can provide is we can say to folks who are living isolated because they're on the internet all the time that we know how to come together as 30 guys who talk to each other and care about each other, and that there's a real sense of compassion and warmth and wisdom that we share with each other. And that on the internet, that's maybe not happening.
So just a very brief response. So I would tend to think that also, but what I wonder from time to time is whether that's, I perceive that as a lack of community and contact. I wonder if that's the way it is for them.
Yeah, and like I said, no, I think we're two different, we are immigrants to the world. At least for me, at age 60, absolutely am coming as somebody from the outside who learned to think in longer streams and to write in longer streams and to process information differently. And so when I come, I have to come with cultural humility. I have to be curious and non-judgmental to the degree that I can. And we had one guy was showing me about Grindr, which you may have heard of that. And it was 11 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and he was showing me that if you type in exactly what you want, and it will beep, and you can say 25 feet away. And so he typed in exactly what he wanted to show. It started beeping. And he said, "Isn't that great? We can meet people." And I said, "You're in an STD clinic. Perhaps you want to raise your standards." But he was very excited and has met friends and so forth. So I do think it's what I have to do there, which is a teaching lesson about the rest of life, is to just be curious and to be open and to know exactly what you said. They're having whatever it is, for sure. They're having a different experience than I have. trying to figure out Twitter and Facebook and all the rest of that. So it's not to think you guys should have what we have only, but to think, wow, there's different ways to build community. Be sure you don't lose this one in pursuit of that one, which means we should be sure that we don't lose that opportunity to meet new and interesting people at the same time.
It all seems so complicated sometimes. So, for instance, human beings, let's say we live, philosophers said that what makes us human is we live in languaging. Mm-hmm. We have this medium called languaging, and consequently it allows us to have a self-image, let's say. Without language, you can't have a self-image. Imaging being part of language. And that gives us our ego. So then Buddhism says mindfulness and direct experience. So all of that, so mindfulness, some would say, well, pure awareness, mindfulness. Is that transcendent of language? So it's just pure awareness. But how does one have an experience without languaging to interpret their experience? So mindfulness of the mind. Mm-hmm. So we use that kind of languaging, and then we want to bring it all present. Enlightenment, being present. Is that devoid of language? Is that pure awareness? And if we're present, well, I'll leave it like that, kind of like that. And there's, the time element, present, the continuousness of presence, leaves past and future perhaps out of it, and languaging, kind of like that.
Yes, I think the issue is, of course, we have language. I think the 4 foundations of mindfulness say, first, know what your body's telling you. Second, to know what your mind and heart are telling you, right? And then, of course, there's going to be language for that. And then what happens is language is also, another way to think of that is story, right? So what you want to do is say what's really, because oftentimes, as soon as we put language to it, it's the language that I think you want to hear, or that my boss wants to hear, that my partner wants to hear. It's the language my parents taught me. It's the language that I think I need to say to fit in. And so it's just to be aware that there is language. And of course you're going to have language, because that's how we do, to describe, and to stay as true as you can to what you really feel. So, as I say, your body tells you when you can trust somebody and feel comfortable. And then you have to put some language to that. Like, what does that mean? And why would I trust this one? He kind of reminds me of somebody who I couldn't trust in the past, or, he's the kind of person that could do damage to me in my career. So the stories start. So to stay true with your original reaction. My reaction tells me that I can trust everybody in here. And then my feeling tells me that, that's, we're all here on a Sunday morning pursuing a spiritual life, so there's probably some reason to think that. And then, I know that I'm discerning. So that then if I know I don't really have time to have brunch with all 30 people here, so then we start making the choices and the language comes in. And so as close as I can stick to that original thing, which is to trust all of you, because that's what my gut told me. The closer I can stick to that, and the better I can wrap my language around the 4 foundations. What I know to be sure, what I'm experiencing in terms of my original emotion, and then just to know that I am going to tell stories, because that's what we do, and to try and keep those stories centered and focused. And the final thing I'll say is that for those who are going to be talking to anybody who asks you about Buddhism and says it's all very complicated, my favorite instruction for Buddhism comes from a teacher who said Buddhism is just like the 3rd grade. You sit down, get quiet, and pay attention. There's your instruction for the day. Sit down, get quiet, and pay attention. Have a good day.
Thank you very much, Steve. Announcements. We have a host, Tage.
Yes, I'm Tage, and I'm your host today. There's some orange cardamom coffee cakes and chocolate chip walnut oatmeal cookies and fruit. Enjoy. There's hot tea also. If you drink hot tea, and if you could just rinse your mug out in the hot soapy water in the kitchen, that would be great. There's a sign-up list for our newsletter on the credenza. There's also some extra newsletters out there as well. There's a group that gets together at 12:30 for a brunch. I don't know how scandalous it is. Probably not too scandalous. Anyway, if you're interested in that brunch, people get together at the door at 12:30. And is that it? Oh, the Donna Bowl, right. I'm going to be walking around with the Donna Bowl. The suggested donation is $5 to $8, and certainly we don't turn away money.
Anything else?
Yeah, I've been in touch with Harv Witten on the phone, and I'm going to put his contact information on the sign-up sheet because he wants to get our newsletter. So anyone's welcome to take his address, phone number off the sign-up sheet.
For the arts and leisure section of the morning, I want to recommend a fabulous new movie called The Artist, which it has a pure uprising of joy in it. So I'd recommend that. Okay, let's get in a circle. Do you want to give a dedication of your
So we dedicate the merit of our practice today to ourselves and each other as we go through the next few weeks, that we embrace the great joy that is our community, the great compassion that gay men bring to each other, and the great wisdom that we share with everyone else. May we be happy, may we be well cared for, may we live in peace.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.